The matter of the missing Martian millionaire. Part 1. I must begin this second tale by explaining that just as in the incident of the chemical reaction, the promise of secrecy which we gave at the start of the exploit has long lapsed. For nothing of which I am about to tell you, which was at the time private, has not already been divulged to the public by other agents than myself. Thus I am free of conscience, for I am not compromising any commitment either I or Ezra made all those years ago. However, though the details concerning the missing Dr. Alexei Marsden and his unusual interests in Martian life have subsequently been brought into the light, the full scope of the way in which Ezra and I were involved in this affair has hitherto remained in the dark. As I have decided to tell you this history of Ezra Lockwood and myself, and our work as it often connected with the Atlantean project, I have deemed it time this particular chapter be laid bare in its entirety, so that you may see how it brought us yet another step closer to comprehending the extent of this daring and innovative venture. In contrast to our time in Texas and the bright Naptu facility, and under the sweltering southern sun, this adventure began in our own dim apartment at Beacon Hill on a dripping, dismal day at the end of April. It had been a few weeks since that experience in Houston, and, as life for Ezra and I had returned rapidly to the same slow monotony in which we had comfortably existed before, I had no thought of us ever finding ourselves again in another such situation. On that day I sat thinking in my chair by the window, where a persistent tapping of the rain upon the pane made the apartment feel cozy and comfortable. I was musing about idea spread, a term I had created to encompass all things around the diffusing, disseminating, and propagating of information and ideas throughout time, place, and ideology. I admit I think about this often, but my rumination on this particular day was inspired by a headline I had just read. So put out by this article's title and the devious tactics the journalist had employed in conceiving it, I hadn't made it any further into the piece. Ezra was in the room as well, working on a holographic topographical map of the Irrawaddy River and Myanmar's Kachin state. He had been diligently plotting ancient roads and temples and cities for several days, using the latest LiDAR scans. We had not spoken to one another for quite some time, possibly an hour or more, and by all appearances he was completely enveloped in his work, so I was surprised when he broke the silence and said casually, "What in your article has made you so broody, John?" I had said nothing to him of my thoughts. In fact, I was certain the last exchange we had had was my teasing him about the possibility of finding proof of Alexander the Great deep in the heart of the Indian subcontinent. It was a little pet theory of one of his colleagues, which Ezra thought absolutely absurd. So of course I couldn't help bringing it up occasionally, as if I truly thought it a possibility. He had quickly repeated his previous outcries against such things and said, "Undertaking to prove a theory, whatever the theory, is poor archaeology. Archaeologists should have an absolutely open mind without pet theories," he had asserted. "If they have a theory, they will commit to proving that theory and willfully disregard anything contrary to it. Prejudice and bias will color all their discoveries, and in my opinion, such people do not belong in the field." "That's pretty harsh," I had responded. He had shrugged and said, "Objectivity is the only way to truth. How much good data has been ignored and rejected because it did not fit with the beliefs or ideas of someone." As I said before, that had been our exchange over an hour ago, and now Ezra was questioning why I was so deep in thought concerning this article, which I hadn't been aware he had even seen me reading. I called it up again and read aloud the heading, my frustration evident. "The missing Martian millionaire. How absurd. Everything about that is incorrect. He's a billionaire without question. Everyone knows that. He isn't a Martian no more than someone visiting Florida is a Floridian. And lastly, he isn't missing. He's just in the field doing his experiments. You can't go missing on Mars." "What are you talking about, John?" Ezra asked. You don't know? I scoffed. Dr. Alexei Marsden, the ultra-wealthy inventor that bought his way onto the last Mars mission? Sorry, John, as you know, news is so rarely reliable I really don't take any interest. He responded phlegmatically. Well, that's the problem, I argued. How can we know what is happening in our world when the news is this unreliable, with the writers and publishers more concerned about a clever alliteration than an accurate substantive title? I waited for Ezra to respond with a supporting statement to this fervent declaration, but he instead returned to his work with a dismissive air. I simmered a while wondering why he could get worked up about false information from 2,000 years ago and yet be indifferent about this modern problem. However, as my eyes remained upon the article, I found myself reading further into the body of the story. Some way through the piece, I came upon something peculiar and said aloud to Ezra, It seems you and this Marsden have a mutual interest. He, too, is fascinated by ancient civilizations. Ezra peered up briefly and asked, In what area? Oh, not somewhere you're likely to be familiar with, I said, barely containing an involuntary smile. John, I'm familiar with essentially every ancient site. I couldn't restrain a laugh at the confidence in his response and said, Sorry, Ezra, I'm certain you're not familiar with this one. You see, Marsden has a much broader scope than you. He's interested in ancient life on Mars. With an eye roll, my unamused roommate returned his attention to his own work. Oh, come now, Ezra. Don't you want to hear about your fellow ancient archaeologist? I entreated. He seems to be quite a brilliant man. Maybe he's onto something. Ezra, without responding, gingerly manipulated his controller wand, marking a path through the low hills connecting two small villages on his projection. Intensely focused, he scrutinized the scans from which he was working. His ability to turn what appeared to me to be meaningless grooves and bumps and swells into roads and hills and settlements was impressive. This work also fascinated me as I imagined how different life was for the people who actually walked those paths and lived in those huts. To them it was only life, and surely no one thousands of years later would care about their clay pots and refuse pits. Yet, here was this man of the future, using the latest technology to map their humdrum day-to-day lives to the most minute detail. Finished with the trail, Ezra set down his wand and, looking at me, said, Why don't you just read the whole article to me, John? As it seems I will get no work done until you get this off your chest. The whole thing? I asked, surprised. Yes, the whole thing, so you can no longer scoff at my ignorance concerning this Dr. Marsden and how poorly he's being represented by journalists and how superior his ancient extraterrestrial archaeological work is in comparison to my own. I was somehow simultaneously pleased at having won an audience and disappointed at this audience's insipid sarcasm. As I traced back to the start of the article, Ezra rose and, going to the window, stood looking out. The lights were low in our apartment, the better for Ezra to work with his projection so that, despite the clouds, his tall, lean figure was silhouetted against the gloomy light. The rain pattered on as I began. The Missing Martian Millionaire. Yesterday morning, April the 27th, NASA received word from Mars that Dr. Alexei Marsden, the guest microbiologist at the Harmony Research Station, the HRS, did not return after making an unscheduled excursion onto the Martian surface. Dr. Marsden has several experiments and pieces of equipment dotted about the Tharsis Rise, and is known to visit them with what Base Commander Abraham Harding has termed an impropitious impulsiveness. However, it is clear to this journalist, Harding's official public reports have been tempered and neutered, and the actual words spoken directly to the microbiologist on Mars by Harding would have certainly been much more severe. I assert this opinion because on several occasions Dr. Marsden has taken vehicles without permission, affecting the scheduled work of other scientists and station personnel. He has also returned long after due, breaking certain protocols for curfew and station maintenance lockdowns, and overall seems to have exhibited an ambivalent and selfish attitude about the work and duties of his fellow Martian inhabitants. Commander Harding, known for his rigorous and disciplined leadership and honored by both the Royal Navy and the American government, has proven his ability to coordinate, supervise, and manage during his past 25 years of service. These competencies, and many others which Harding possesses, were essential in the International Committee assigning him this important and esteemed position at the Harmony Station. Therefore, a flippant civilian such as Dr. Marsden breaking protocols and defying regulations can only lead to justifiable aggravation and conflict with such a tight-ship man. Yet we should not forget the accomplishments of Dr. Alexei Marsden himself, a highly successful scientist and inventor. He has been a fellow Bostonian for nearly 30 years now. His work with microbial fuel cells, known as MFCs, has produced many significant breakthroughs in the technology, and it appears it was some combination of this groundbreaking advancement and his vast independent wealth which secured Marsden's passage on the Prosper mission to Mars over 2 years ago. Reports have shown that Marsden's MFC systems have been a great success at the HRS, increasing non-solar power production by nearly 45%, while decreasing power consumption for processes like waste reclamation and hydrogen production. Also, an array of remote sensors has been established across the vast Tharsis region. These hundreds of individual devices are powered solely by Dr. Marsden's micro-MFC systems, ensuring non-stop data capturing regardless of time of day or year or the weather. This technology is light years beyond previous systems, which were powered solely by the sun, as solar rays, while still the primary source of power on Mars, are extremely labor-intensive, requiring constant cleaning and monitoring. Solar power also demands large storage capacities, especially for the powerful spring and summer storms, which can leave the HRS in the dark for days on end. However, Dr. Marsden's work on Mars may not have been isolated to his MFCs. While still on Earth, the scientist is known to have spoken both publicly and privately of the possibilities of ancient life on Mars, a possibility many scientists had looked for in the early years of Martian exploration. Yet, with each mission failing to produce any substantive evidence, the speculation has lost popularity. Undaunted, however, Marsden has pressed, year after year, for more ground-penetrating surveys, particularly in the area of Noctis Labyrinthus, where the regolith is marked by countless pits and fossae, long depressions in the Martian surface. Most scientists believe these are natural formations caused by the stretching and tearing of the crust due to volcanic activity. However, Dr. Marsden seems to think these formations may be something more. We can only speculate, though, as his comments have been vague and shielded by some of his powerful friends, who have stepped in at times to minimalize Dr. Marsden's statements and claim the media is exaggerating his words. That was the state of things when Dr. Alexei Marsden left us mere earthlings behind, and now, while on planet, he seems to have made every effort to do his own research. More than 2/3 of his sensors, which are meant to capture data all around the Tharsis Rise, are situated in the Noctis Labyrinthus area. This is also the area where he is so often taking his unscheduled trips. He has pressed NASA even harder for more penetrating satellite scans of this region, in his own words claiming, "Scanning the subsurface of Mars is of far greater importance than monitoring the weather." And when he again sauntered out onto the red planet yesterday, while many of his fellow Martian inhabitants were working diligently preparing for a storm which was racing toward the Harmony Station, he appeared to be heading toward none other than Noctis Labyrinthus. After waiting some hours for Dr. Marsden's return, Commander Harding deployed a search party. As a communication network is not scheduled for completion until after the Success mission reaches Mars with more materials, surface-to-surface interaction is limited to about 5 miles in ideal conditions. The search party had only a few pings from a passing satellite some hours earlier, indicating Dr. Marsden's hopper had been heading east toward Noctis Labyrinthus. Another satellite would be swinging past within the hour, and they hoped to make verbal contact and pin an exact location. I have been told by my NASA contact the latest hoppers can traverse 100 miles in about 30 minutes in ideal conditions, placing the search team about halfway to Noctis Labyrinthus by the time they received Dr. Marsden's location. They believed this was perfect. They could course correct if the negligent scientist was further north or south. However, the location never came. The satellite easily identified the 3 searching hoppers But Dr. Marsden's craft did not transmit a signal, and Commander Harding could not hail the missing man verbally. Their communication window closed, the team continued forward to the maze that is Noctis Labyrinthus. The operators leapt higher than usual, and using onboard scanners and transmitters, as well as their own eyes, the team scoured the regolith for signs of the shining white hopper. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful, and, due to the fading light and oncoming storm, they were forced to turn back, Commander Harding stating he cannot risk 6 lives for 1. The search party struggled to maintain their course home as visibility deteriorated, and the winds rose to a persistent 30 to 40 miles per hour, hampering gliding. Within 10 miles of the Harmony station, the storm crashed into the team, forcing them to remain on the ground. Relying on weak GPS signals and topographical scans, they struggled against the blasting sand-laden winds, now gusting above 80 miles an hour. Mars was pitch black and roaring when the 3 hoppers ducked into the bay after 6 hours of stressful searching. The storm raged for nearly 14 more hours, forcing everyone to remain inside the HRS. Reports to Earth were intermittent during this time, but NASA monitored the storm with, if possible, greater attention than ever before, hoping for a break where another search party might be sent out. They saw a chance and relayed the opportunity to Commander Harding. They had an even smaller window than before, only 4 or 5 hours. As we slept peacefully in our warm beds here in Boston, the team of 6 brave Martians rushed out onto the blasted, hazy Tharsis Rise toward Noctis Labyrinthus once more. Yet despite every effort to make the best time possible and search new areas, again the team saw nothing more than the deserted Martian wasteland. Dispirited, they turned again to make the long, arduous trek back to Harmony. Having scoured Noctis Labyrinthus for more than 2 hours, the storm was already whipping against the search party's hoppers before they were even halfway home. Forced to crawl for 2 hours in the blinding storm, they at last returned to the base as the rest of us were peacefully having our lunch this afternoon. At 1 o'clock this afternoon, NASA announced that another break in the storm may occur within the next 16 to 18 hours. That would be between 5 and 7 tomorrow morning for those of us in the Eastern time zone. If this break occurs, they have determined Commander Harding will attempt one last time to retrieve the missing scientist. If he is not found then, he will be confirmed dead, as his life support cannot possibly last beyond 48 hours. If this is the case, as it seems the most likely, Dr. Alexei Marsden will be the first person to die on Mars. Yet, as we consider all this here on Earth, I wonder if we are being told all the facts. Did Dr. Alexei Marsden break protocol once more and travel recklessly hundreds of miles away from the safety of the HRS with a known storm approaching? What would prompt him to do so? Regardless of his unique interest in life on Mars, what time-sensitive research would drive a man to put himself at such risk? If the evidence for alien life has comfortably rested beneath the ancient regolith for eons, enduring countless storms and geological shifts, what's another few days? One must wonder if there is not a simpler conclusion to be drawn. Is it possible dealing with Dr. Marsden's antics had become simply untenable? Too much for one or more of his fellow Martians to continue to endure? Had he and Harding had one too many disagreements? We can hardly imagine what life is like for them up there. We see the little video clips, we hear the little news, but we forget, millions of miles from their fellow human beings, isolated in a way in which we simply cannot fathom, are 16 people who have been absolutely pressed together for almost 2 years. 16 people who have only seen their families through recorded videos, who have missed innumerable precious and sacred moments. Births, anniversaries, birthdays, and even deaths. 16 people who have not breathed a breath of fresh air, have not felt a drop of rain, a ray of sunlight, or a gust of wind upon their bare skin, but are trapped, encased in that small station with whoever happened to be sent on the mission. They cannot escape one another, facing the same irritations and annoyances day after day, chafing, festering in the same monotonous isolation. We do not have to stretch our imagination far to see the terrible possibilities of such an abysmal existence. I sat the slate down on the end table and felt myself pulled suddenly back into our own world here on Earth, into our quiet apartment with a tinkling rain outside, a persistent tattoo to the low hum of the distant traffic on Cambridge Street. After a few moments, Ezra broke the silence, saying, "Well, John, do you disapprove entirely of that piece? Was it pure sensationalism?" "Well, no doubt the writer included a great deal of useful information," I answered him. "But he also felt free to make all sorts of suggestions and accusations." "Indeed he did," Ezra remarked flatly as he turned away from the window and went to his work once more. I was disappointed at having so easily lost his attention. I wanted to discuss the story further somehow, though I knew there was nothing to say. It felt unfinished. That was because it was. We wouldn't know more until tomorrow, probably. There was nothing our jawing would do to change that. Feeling as though it was to no purpose, but desperate, I baited Ezra. "So you didn't happen to solve this mystery, did you?" "What mystery?" Ezra asked. "The location of the missing Martian millionaire?" "Yes," I said, sticking to the nonsensical question. "Did you determine where Marsden is just by hearing the article?" Ezra glanced up at me, his brow furrowed. "Are you making fun of me, John?" "No, and yes," I conceded, feeling guilty at my game. "I just want to hear what you think of it all. I'm sure it's impossible for you to know where he is, and because this proves you can't know everything, all will be right in the world again. And yet, I am a little disappointed, I guess. Part of me hoped you would have something revelatory to say, something remarkable which was obvious but everyone else missed." With a slight smile, which Ezra rarely does, he said, "And I am supposedly the enigma?" I could say nothing more, and so the room fell quiet again. Eventually I rose, and too stood before the dripping window looking out. The narrow cobblestone street below was desolate and running with water. It appeared cold and forlorn, the roses and hydrangeas still only naked sticks in the planters along the streets. The indecisive atmosphere produced that odd effect, where the street lamps seemed dim and gloomy, while if the sky were brighter, the day would be less bleak, and if it were darker, the lights themselves would appear the more cheery and homey. But instead it was neither, and the effect was dismal. As I stood there, taking in our little portion of earth, a car slipped into our street and eased along between the old brownstones. It was a large black luxury car. The driver's hands, gripping the wheel firmly, were just visible to me from my third-story vantage, but of his face I could see nothing. I did not suppose I would know him anyway. Going forward slowly, the vehicle stopped directly below me. The driver stepped out with an ultrasonic umbrella held before him and walked to the rear door. Yet the passenger had not waited for the driver, but instead, holding his own umbrella above him, waved the driver back to the car, while he himself appeared to be heading for our building. I had seen him only briefly, and from a top-down view, but my mind immediately began racing, thinking I knew him from somewhere. Yet I was still surprised when an alert announced someone was paging to see us. The video lit up on our display, and the man was speaking. "Good evening, Mr. Lockwood and Mr. Spencer. I would very much like to speak to you if you have a moment." I stared, still unable to place the face. I heard Ezra's voice calmly answering, saying, "Yes, Mr. Dakar, we are available. Please, come up." Mr. Dakar? My mind wondered. Atlas Dakar, the man from Houston? The one with a secret project? He's coming here? My mind panicked. I scrambled to straighten up the apartment, saying in a fluster, "What do you think he wants?" "I thought we had already determined my abilities have limits," Ezra answered while continuing his work. All too soon there was the knock on the door. I opened it to see the man standing before me. Though slightly shorter than myself, he was an imposing figure, broad-chested and very direct in manner. "Good evening, Mr. Spencer," he said, offering his hand. I shook it as I made way for him to enter, saying myself, "Please come in, Mr. Dakar." I was, understandably, a little off balance with the situation. We generally do not have people in our apartment who are not close acquaintances, but here was this man, a shaker and mover in the world, suddenly sprung into our quiet little commonplace lives. Ezra stood and shook Mr. Dakar's hand in turn. Mr. Dakar saying politely to him also, "Good evening, Mr. Lockwood." I was impressed. He remembered us by face. A hesitant few seconds passed as I struggled to comprehend the moment. Undeterred, Mr. Dakar confidently stepped toward Ezra's projection, which still filled a large area of the dining table. "Where is this?" he asked. His accent, though slight, caused me to wonder where he was from. His eyes a vivid clear blue and skin lightly browned. I guessed Southeastern European possibly, though I was never very good at these things. Ezra was answering Mr. Dakar's few polite questions when our visitor then turned to me and, addressing us both, said, "I was very impressed with the two of you after that little incident at Naptu." "I really did nothing," I interjected, determined not to be included once more in undeserved praise. "You were splendid, John," Ezra said seriously. "You were my interviewer and distractor. You dealt with the people so that I was left to do my observing undisturbed. You really were quite indispensable." I admit I was stunned a moment by this unexpected praise. I had not really thought of it that way, and while not admitting to have enjoyed playing that part, I suddenly understood the necessity of it for Ezra. Mr. Dakar began again, however, interrupting my moment of satisfaction. "That is all fine, but that is not of what I am speaking. It is in the days following Mr. Lockwood's revelation that I have been most impressed by the both of you. You in particular, Mr. Spencer." I was quite shocked again, and felt I had done nothing worthy of this man's praise. "Yes, when I heard from Mr. Hunter you were connected with the media and journalists, I felt certain that within a day at the most, the story of chemical sabotage would be in the public's hands. But this was not the case. I waited days, then weeks, and nothing was ever said. This impressed me very much, compelling me to do some research into you two, and found Mr. Spencer to be more of an inquirer than a disseminator. You study, you do not divulge." He was accurate to a point, but to be honest, it was a private itch I had long held to write, myself, the news of the day. But as a profession was so laden with unfaithful, dishonest people, I did not know how to do so credibly. It is only with the sharing of these tales that I have been able to scratch that itch. I said nothing of this at the time, however, and Mr. Dakar went on. "As for Ezra, he has never shown a tendency for publicity or desire for attention's sake, and this was good to know. I inquired further from Mr. Hunter, whom you had assisted before, and asked as to the terms of your agreement, and his opinion of you both. Again, high marks. He explained to me that he asked only your word of discretion, no formal agreement, no NDA. All very fine in my mind, for NDAs are for adversaries and not friends. They do not build trust and confidence for either party, but make assumptions of distrust and ulterior motives. And I employ them only when I must and with whom I must." Pausing, Mr. Dakar strode confidently across the room, and, like Ezra and I had done, stood looking out of the window. But unlike Ezra, who had looked ahead, and I who had looked down, Mr. Dakar looked up. I shot a confused glance to Ezra, who himself stood patient and calm. At length the wealthy man turned back to us and said, "I would like to operate on the same terms, gentlemen. My work and my projects are not always my own to divulge, but my secrets are never for ill will against the world, but to advance my humanist enterprises as successfully as possible with the least amount of hindrance and distraction. The actions of Miss Blanchard are a fine example of just such things. An individual, acting on entirely selfish motives without regard to the greater initiative, hindering the progress of meaningful work. Had this scientist been even more aware of what we were endeavoring to do, she might have raised her price or caused greater calamity." Looking hard at us both now, his blue eyes piercing even in the low light, he inquired, "Would you, Mr. Lockwood, and you, Mr. Spencer, be willing to operate on those same terms as you dealt so confidentially with Mr. Hunter?" Ezra answered smoothly and without pause, "There's no need for any great ceremony or preamble on my part, Mr. Dakar. I will treat you with the same respect and discretion I would the stranger on the street, or Mr. Hunter, or whomever. It is all the same to me. If there is some activity which is illegal and my civic obligation is to expose that unlawful transgression, I shall do so without hesitation. If not, then it is no concern of mine. I froze, certain our guest would react in some negative way to this direct response. But he implacably said, "Perfect. And you, Mr. Spencer?" He turned his eyes directly upon me, and I responded, though not nearly as composedly, that I would deal in the same manner as Ezra. "Perfect," again was his response. Then, sitting in the chair I had previously occupied, he said, "Then let us begin, for I have very little time and the stakes are rather higher than your previous case. Indeed, in this affair, it is a matter of life and death." Thank you for listening to the Atlantean Mysteries. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and consider sharing it with a friend and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more and to connect with this project, you can find us on most social platforms by searching for the Atlantean Mysteries and on our website www.theatlanteanmysteries.com. For information, suggestions, promotion, and reproduction, please send an email directly to hello@theatlanteanmysteries.com.